Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the January 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Chapter 5, Contradictions in the General Formula of Capital, from Kapital Volume 1 by Karl Marx, 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. If you do contribute via Patreon, please do so through the web or the Android app, as the Apple iOS app will take a 30 to 40% cut. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So Chapter 5, Contradictions in the General Formula of Capital, continues Part 2 of Kapital Volume 1, Transformation of Money into Capital. In the previous chapter, we discussed the circuit of capital, M to C to M prime, which stands for money to commodity to more money. This stands in contrast to the circulation of commodities, C to M to C, a commodity being a good or service produced for exchange. In C to M to C, people enter the market with a commodity, something that they produced but do not personally need, and so they're offering it for exchange in order to get an equivalent amount of money that they can then use to get something that they do need, the final C, the final commodity. Something which somebody else produced which they did not need but were just producing to exchange. And as Marx noted, there's a natural limit in the circulation of commodities in that people are engaging in that circuit in order to meet certain natural appetites, needs, wants, desires. So those are built-in limits on how much people even want to engage in that. They're not going to seek out commodities that they really don't need or desire to use. The circuit of capital, on the other hand, does not have such a limit. M to C to M prime results in more money, but there's no real natural cap to that, so it just keeps going. In other words, if you go out looking for a toothbrush, you might need one and maybe two as a backup, but you don't need 1,000 or 10,000 or 1,000,000, because what you're interested in doing is keeping your teeth clean. The capitalist, on the other hand, is not interested in resources for their qualitative use value, but for the exchange value that they represent. They're interested in amassing 1,000 or 10,000 or 1,000,000 toothbrushes, not because they really like keeping their teeth clean, but so that they can sell them for more money. And how much is enough money? Well, there's really no limit. Individual capitalists' conquests may be limited by losses that they sustain in the market due to unfavorable trades, but overall the growth of capital is self-expanding without limit. Thus, Marx called the capitalist a rational miser. But while this circuit may be without limit, it's not without contradictions. While M to C to M prime may explain the circulation of capital, it really doesn't explain where the additional value comes from, what Marx called surplus value, the source of profit. And this is where labor factors in, which is not represented, on its face, in the MC to M prime formula. So we have to remember, capital is a kind of social weapon that is used in the exploitation of labor to amass more value, more capital, for the capitalist, which again is then turned against the worker to exploit their labor. So with that as introduction, let's read Chapter 5, Contradictions in the General Formula of Capital. The form which circulation takes when money becomes capital is opposed to all the laws we have hitherto investigated, bearing on the nature of commodities, value, and money, and even of circulation itself. What distinguishes this form from that of the simple circulation of commodities is the inverted order of succession of the two antithetical processes, sale and purchase. How can this purely formal distinction between these processes change their character, as it were, by magic? But that's not all. This inversion has no existence for 2 out of the 3 persons who transact business together. As capitalist, I buy commodities from A and sell them again to B, but as a simple owner of commodities, I sell them to B and then purchase fresh ones from A. A and B see no difference between the 2 sets of transactions. They are merely buyers or sellers, and I, on occasion, meet them as a mere owner of either money or commodities, as a buyer or a seller. And what's more, in both sets of transactions, I am opposed to A only as a buyer and to B only as a seller, to the one only as money, to the other only as commodities, and to neither of them as capital or a capitalist, or representative of anything that is more than money or commodities, or that can produce any effect beyond what money and commodities can. For me, the purchase from A and the sale to B are part of a series, but the connection between the 2 acts exists for me, as capitalist, alone. A does not trouble himself about my transaction with B, nor does B about my business with A. and if I offered to explain to them the meritorious nature of my action in inverting the order of succession, they would probably point out to me that I was mistaken as to that order of succession, and that the whole transaction, instead of beginning with a purchase and ending with a sale, began on the contrary with a sale and was concluded with a purchase. In truth, my first act, the purchase, was from the standpoint of A, a sale, and my second act, the sale, was from the standpoint of B, a purchase. Not content with that, A and B would declare that the whole series was superfluous and nothing but hocus pocus, that for the future A would buy direct from B and B sell direct to A. Thus the whole transaction would be reduced to a single act, forming an isolated, non-complemented phase in the ordinary circulation of commodities, a mere sale from A's point of view, and from B's, a mere purchase. The inversion, therefore, of the order of succession does not take us outside the sphere of the simple circulation of commodities, and we must rather look whether there is in this simple circulation anything permitting an expansion of the value that enters into circulation, and consequently a creation of surplus value. So a quick comment here, Marx pointed out in the earlier chapters how C to M to C and M to C to M prime consist of basically the same components, that is, sales and purchases. So the actions of the capitalist, Marx points out, are really not anything fundamentally different in that they're just buying and selling, trading money and commodities like anybody else, but they're doing it with a different aim, by this buying and selling, to end up with more value than that with which they started. In C to M to C, what you're looking for is a qualitative transformation. You're looking to take something which you can produce, a good or service, but which you can't use, and to trade it through the intermediary of money for another commodity which you can use, which is qualitatively different. So you're looking for a qualitative transformation of the same amount of value, but the capitalist is entering in from a different standpoint, which is not concerned with the qualitative use values of the commodities involved, but of the quantitative exchange value represented by both the money and the commodities that are in the trade. They're trying to gain in quantity. So again, where does this increase in value, the surplus value, come from? Let's continue. Let us take the process of circulation in a form under which it presents itself as a simple and direct exchange of commodities. This is always the case when two owners of commodities buy from each other, and on the settling day the amounts mutually owing are equal and cancel each other. The money in this case is money of account, and serves to express the value of the commodities by their prices, but is not itself in the shape of hard cash confronted with them. So far as regards use values, it is clear that both parties may gain some advantage. Both part with goods that, as use values, are of no service to them, and receive others that they can make use of. And there may also be a further gain. A, who sells wine and buys corn, possibly produces more wine, with given labor time, than farmer B could, and B, on the other hand, more corn than wine grower A could. A, therefore, may get, for the same exchange value, more corn, and B more wine than each would respectively get, without any exchange by producing their own corn and wine. With reference, therefore, to use value, there's good ground for saying that, quote, exchange is a transaction by which both sides gain. Footnote here, quoting from Destot de Tracy, exchange is a transaction in which the two contracting parties always gain, both of them. Back to the main text. It is otherwise with exchange value. Quote, a man who has plenty of wine and no corn treats with a man who has plenty of corn and no wine. An exchange takes place between them of corn to the value of 50 for wine of the same value. This act produces no increase of exchange value either for the one or for the other, for each of them already possessed before the exchange a value equal to that which they acquired by means of that operation. That's quoting from Mercier de la Rivière. The result is not altered by introducing money as a medium of circulation between the commodities and making the sale and the purchase two distinct acts. Quoting the same source, whether one of those two values is money, or they are both ordinary commodities, is in itself a matter of complete indifference. Unquote. The value of a commodity is expressed in its price before it goes into circulation, and is therefore a precedent condition of circulation, not its result. Quoting La Trosna, it is not the parties to a contract who decide on the value, that has been decided before the contract. Abstractly considered, that is, apart from circumstances and not immediately flowing from the laws of the simple circulation of commodities, there is in an exchange nothing, if we accept the replacing of one use value by another, but a metamorphosis, a mere change in the form of the commodity. The same exchange value, i.e. the same quantity of incorporated social labor, remains throughout in the hands of the owner of the commodity, first in the shape of his own commodity, then in the form of the money for which they exchanged it, and lastly in the shape of the commodity they buy with that money. This change of form does not imply a change in the magnitude of the value, but the change which the value of the commodity undergoes in this process is limited to a change in its money form. This form exists first as the price of the commodity offered for sale, then as an actual sum of money, which however was already expressed in the price, and lastly as the price of an equivalent commodity. This change of form no more implies, taken alone, a change in the quantity of value than does the change of a £5 note into sovereigns, half-sovereigns, and shillings. So far, therefore, as the circulation of commodities effects a change in the form alone of their values, and is free from disturbing influences, it must be the exchange of equivalents. Little as vulgar economy knows about the nature of value, yet whenever it wishes to consider the phenomena of circulation in their purity, it assumes that supply and demand are equal, which amounts to this, that their effect is nil. If, therefore, as regards the use values exchanged, both buyer and seller may possibly gain something, this is not the case as regards the exchange values. Here we must rather say, where equality exists, there can be no gain. Quoting Galliani. It is true commodities may be sold at prices deviating from their values, but these deviations are to be considered as infractions of the laws of the exchange of commodities, which in its normal state is an exchange of equivalents, consequently no method for increasing value. Quoting Latrosna, the exchange becomes unfavorable for one of the parties when some external circumstance comes to lessen or increase the price. Then equality is infringed, but this infringement arises from that cause and not from the exchange itself. Quoting Latrosna again, exchange is by its nature a contract which rests on equality, i.e. it takes place between two equal values, and it is not a means of self-enrichment, since as much is given as is received. Hence we see that behind all attempts to represent the circulation of commodities as a source of surplus value, there lurks a quid pro quo, a mixing up of use value and exchange value. For instance, Condillac says it is not true that on an exchange of commodities we give value for value. On the contrary, each of the two contracting parties in every case gives a less for a greater value. If we really exchanged equal values, neither party could make a profit, and yet they both gain, or ought to gain. Why? The value of a thing consists solely in its relation to our wants. What is more to the one is less to the other, and vice versa. It is not to be assumed that we offer for sale articles required for our own consumption. We wish to part with a useless thing in order to get one that we need. We want to give less for more. It was natural to think that in an exchange value was given for value whenever each of the articles exchanged was of equal value with the same quantity of gold. But there's another point to be considered in our calculation. The question is whether we both exchange something superfluous for something necessary." Unquote. We see in this passage how Condillac not only confuses use value with exchange value, but in a really childish manner assumes that in a society in which the production of commodities is well developed, each producer produces their own means of subsistence, and throws into circulation only the excess over their own requirements. Footnote here, Latrosna therefore answers his friend Condillac with justice as follows, quote, "In a developed society, absolutely nothing is superfluous." Unquote. At the same time, in a bantering way, he remarks, quote, "If both the persons who exchange receive more to an equal amount and part with less to an equal amount, they both get the same." Unquote. It is because Condillac has not the remotest idea of the nature of exchange value that he has been chosen by Herr Professor Wilhelm Roscher as a proper person to answer for the soundness of his own childish notions. Back to the main text. Still, Condillac's argument is frequently used by modern economists, more especially when the point is to show that the exchange of commodities in its developed form, commerce, is productive of surplus value. For instance, quote, "Commerce adds value to products, for the same products in the hands of consumers are worth more than in the hands of producers, and it may strictly be considered an act of production." That's quoting from S.P. Newman's Elements of Political Economy. But commodities are not paid for twice over, once on account of their use value and again on account of their value. And though the use value of a commodity is more serviceable to the buyer than to the seller, its money form is more serviceable to the seller. Would otherwise they sell it? We might therefore just as well say that the buyer performs, quote, "strictly an act of production" by converting stockings, for example, into money. If commodities, or commodities and money, of equal exchange value, and consequently equivalents, are exchanged, it is plain that no one abstracts more value from than they throw into circulation. There is no creation there of surplus value, and in its normal form, the circulation of commodities demands the exchange of equivalents. But in actual practice, the process does not retain its normal form. Let us therefore assume an exchange of non-equivalence. In any case, the market for commodities is only frequented by owners of commodities, and the power which these persons exercise over each other is none other than the power of their commodities. The material variety of these commodities is the material incentive to the act of exchange, and makes buyers and sellers mutually dependent, because none of them possesses the object of their own wants, and each holds in their hand the object of another's wants. Besides these material differences of their use values, there is only one other difference between commodities, namely, that between their bodily form and the form into which they are converted by sale, the difference between commodities and money. And consequently, the owners of commodities are distinguishable only as sellers, those who own commodities, and buyers, those who own money. Suppose then that by some inexplicable privilege, the seller is enabled to sell their commodities above their value, what's worth 100 for 110, in which case the price is nominally raised 10%. The seller therefore pockets a surplus value of 10, but after they have sold, they become a buyer. A third owner of commodities comes to them now as seller, who in this capacity also enjoys the privilege of selling their commodities 10% too expensive. Our friend gained 10 as a seller only to lose it again as a buyer. Quoting the essential principles of the wealth of nations, by the augmentation of the nominal value of the produce, sellers are not enriched, since what they gain as sellers, they precisely expend in the quality of buyers." Unquote. The net result is that all owners of commodities sell their goods to one another at 10% above their value, which comes precisely to the same as if they sold them at their true value. Such a general and nominal rise of prices has the same effect as if the values had been expressed in weight of silver instead of in weight of gold. The nominal prices of commodities would rise, but the real relation between their values would remain unchanged. Let us make the opposite assumption, that the buyer has the privilege of purchasing commodities under their value. In this case, it is no longer necessary to bear in mind that they in their turn will become a seller. They were so before they became buyer. They had already lost 10% in selling before they gained 10% as buyer. Quoting Latrosna, if one is compelled to sell a quantity of a certain product for 18 livres when it has a value of 24 livres, when one employs the same amount of money in buying, one will receive for 18 livres the same quantity of the product as 24 livres would have bought otherwise. Unquote. Everything is just as it was. The creation of surplus value, and therefore the conversion of money into capital, can consequently be explained neither on the assumption that commodities are sold above their value, nor that they are bought below their value. Quoting Mercier de la Rivière, a seller can normally only succeed in raising the prices of their commodities if they agree to pay, by and large, more for the commodities of the other sellers. And for the same reason, a consumer can normally only pay less for their purchases if they submit to a similar reduction in the prices of the things they sell. Unquote. So comment here, what Marx is saying, and this is stressed also in Value, Price, and Profit, is that the increase in money, M prime, or the profit, does not come from playing around with the prices, as these tend to cancel out overall in the marketplace. Rather, it's the result of an additional input which so far has not been accounted for, that input being labor. And as we will see, capitalism has hidden within it all kinds of free labor which the capitalist extracts using capital. But more on the particulars of that later. Continuing, the problem is in no way simplified by introducing irrelevant matters after the manner of Colonel Torrens. Quote, effectual demand consists in the power and inclination on the part of consumers to give for commodities, either by immediate or circuitous barter, some greater portion of capital than their production costs. Unquote. In relation to circulation, producers and consumers meet only as buyers and sellers. To assert that the surplus value acquired by the producer has its origin in the fact that consumers pay for commodities more than their value is only to say, in other words, the owner of commodities possesses, as a seller, the privilege of selling too expensive. The seller has themselves produced the commodities, or represents their producer, but the buyer has to no less extent produced the commodities represented by their money, or represents their producer. The distinction between them is that one buys and the other sells. The fact that the owner of the commodities, under the designation of producer, sells them over their value, and under the designation of consumer, pays too much for them, doesn't carry us a single step further. Quoting G. Ramsey, the idea of profits being paid by the consumers is assuredly very absurd. Who are the consumers? Unquote. To be consistent, therefore, the upholders of the delusion that surplus value has its origin in a nominal rise of prices, or in the privilege which the seller has of selling too expensive, must assume the existence of a class that only buys and doesn't sell, i.e. only consumes and does not produce. The existence of such a class is inexplicable from the standpoint we've so far reached. viz., that of simple circulation. But let us anticipate. The money with which such a class is constantly making purchases must constantly flow into their pockets without any exchange, gratis, by might or right, from the pockets of the commodity owners themselves. To sell commodities above their value to such a class is only to crib back again a part of the money previously given to it. Quote, "When a man is in want of a demand, does Mr. Malthus recommend him to pay some other person to take off his goods?" is a question put by an angry disciple of Ricardo to Malthus, who, like his disciple, Parson Chalmers, economically glorifies this class of simple buyers or consumers. The towns of Asia Minor thus paid a yearly money tribute to ancient Rome. With this money, Rome purchased from them commodities, and purchased them too expensive. The provincials cheated the Romans, and thus got back from their conquerors, in the course of trade, a portion of the tribute. Yet for all that, the conquered were the really cheated. Their goods were still paid for with their own money. That is not the way to get rich or to create surplus value. Let us therefore keep within the bounds of exchange where sellers are also buyers, and buyers sellers. Our difficulty may perhaps have arisen from treating the actors as personifications instead of as individuals. A may be clever enough to get the advantage of B or C without their being able to retaliate. A sells wine worth 40 pounds to B and obtains from them in exchange corn to the value of 50 pounds. A has converted their 40 pounds into 50 pounds, has made more money out of less, and has converted their commodities into capital. Let us examine this a little more closely. Before the exchange, we had 40 pounds worth of wine in the hands of A, and 50 pounds worth of corn in those of B, a total value of 90 pounds. After the exchange, we still have the same total value of 90 pounds. The value in circulation has not increased by 1 iota. It is only distributed differently between A and B. What is a loss of value to B is surplus value to A. What is minus to one is plus to the other. The same change would have taken place if A, without the formality of an exchange, had directly stolen the 10 pounds from B. The sum of the values in circulation can clearly not be augmented by any change in their distribution, any more than the quantity of the precious metals in a country by someone selling a Queen Anne's farthing for a guinea. The capitalist class as a whole in any country cannot overreach themselves. Destutt de Tracy, although, or perhaps because he was a member of the Institute, held the opposite view. He said industrial capitalists make profits because, quote, they all sell for more than it is cost to produce. And to whom do they sell? In the first instance, to one another, unquote. Turn and twist then as we may, the fact remains unaltered. If equivalents are exchanged, no surplus value results, and if non-equivalents are exchanged, still no surplus value. Quoting Say, the exchange of two equal values neither increases nor diminishes the amount of the values available in society, nor does the exchange of two unequal values change anything in the sum of social values, although it adds to the wealth of one person what it removes from the wealth of another, unquote. Say, not in the least troubled as to the consequences of this statement, borrows it almost word for word from the physiocrats. The following example will show how Monsieur Say turned to account the writings of the physiocrats, in his day quite forgotten, for the purpose of expanding the value of his own. His most celebrated saying, products can only be bought with products, runs as follows in the original physiocratic work. Products can only be paid for with products, unquote. Circulation, or the exchange of commodities, begets no value. Quoting F. Wayland, exchange confers no value at all upon products, unquote. The reason is now therefore plain why, in analyzing the standard form of capital, the form under which it determines the economic organization of modern society, we entirely left out of consideration its most popular, and so to say, antediluvian forms, merchants' capital and money lenders' capital. The circuit M to C to M, buying in order to sell more expensive, is seen most clearly in genuine merchants' capital, but the movement takes place entirely within the sphere of circulation. Since, however, it is impossible by circulation alone to account for the conversion of money into capital, for the formation of surplus value, it would appear that merchants' capital is an impossibility, so long as equivalents are exchanged. Quoting Opdyke, under the rule of invariable equivalence, commerce would be impossible. Quoting Engels, the difference between real value and exchange value is based upon this fact, namely that the value of a thing is different from the so-called equivalent given for it in trade, i.e., that this equivalent is no equivalent. Unquote. That merchants' capital, therefore, can only have its origin in the twofold advantage gained over both the selling and the buying producers by the merchant who parasitically shoves himself in between them. It is in this sense that Franklin says, war is robbery, commerce is generally cheating. If the transformation of merchants' money into capital is to be explained otherwise than by the producers being simply cheated, a long series of intermediate steps would be necessary, which at present, when the simple circulation of commodities forms our only assumption, are entirely wanting. What we have said with reference to merchants' capital applies still more to moneylenders' capital. In merchants' capital, the two extremes, the money that is thrown upon the market and the augmented money that is withdrawn from the market, are at least connected by a purchase and a sale, in other words, by the movement of the circulation. In moneylenders' capital, the form M to C to M is reduced to the two extremes without a mean, M to M, money exchanged for more money, a form that is incompatible with the nature of money, and therefore remains inexplicable from the standpoint of the circulation of commodities. Hence Aristotle, quote, "Since crematistic is a double science, one part belonging to commerce, the other to economics, the latter being necessary and praiseworthy, the former based on circulation, and with justice disapproved, for it's not based on nature but on mutual cheating, therefore the usurer is most rightly hated, because money itself is the source of their gain, and is not used for the purposes for which it was invented, for it originated for the exchange of commodities, but interest makes out of money more money. Hence its name, in Greek tokos, interest and offspring. For the begotten are like those who beget them, but interest is money of money, so that of all modes of making a living, this is the most contrary to nature." Unquote. In the course of our investigation, we shall find that both merchants' capital and interest-bearing capital are derivative forms, and at the same time it will become clear why these two forms appear in the course of history before the modern standard form of capital. We have shown that surplus value cannot be created by circulation, and therefore that in its formation something must take place in the background, which is not apparent in the circulation itself. Quoting Ramsay, "Profit in the usual condition of the market is not made by exchanging. Had it not existed before, neither could it after that transaction." Unquote. But can surplus value possibly originate anywhere else than in circulation, which is the sum total of all the mutual relations of commodity owners as far as they're determined by their commodities? Apart from circulation, the commodity owner is in relation only with their own commodity. So far as regards value, that relation is limited to this, that the commodity contains a quantity of their own labor, that quantity being measured by a definite social standard. This quantity is expressed by the value of the commodity, and since the value is reckoned in money of account, this quantity is also expressed by the price, which we will suppose to be 10 pounds. But their labor is not represented both by the value of the commodity and by a surplus over that value, not by a price of 10 that is also a price of 11, not by a value that is greater than itself. The commodity owner can, by their labor, create value, but not self-expanding value. They can increase the value of their commodity by adding fresh labor, and therefore more value to the value in hand, by making, for instance, leather into boots. The same material has now more value because it contains a greater quantity of labor. The boots have therefore more value than the leather, but the value of the leather remains what it was. It has not expanded itself, has not, during the making of the boots, annexed surplus value. It is therefore impossible that outside the sphere of circulation, a producer of commodities can, without coming into contact with other commodity owners, expand value, and consequently convert money or commodities into capital. It is therefore impossible for capital to be produced by circulation, and it is equally impossible for it to originate apart from circulation. It must have its origin both in circulation and yet not in circulation. We have therefore obtained a double result. The conversion of money into capital has to be explained on the basis of the laws that regulate the exchange of commodities, in such a way that the starting point is the exchange of equivalents. Footnote here, from the foregoing investigation, the reader will see that the statement only means that the formation of capital must be possible, even though the price and value of a commodity be the same, for its formation cannot be attributed to any deviation of the one from the other. If prices actually differ from values, we must first of all reduce the former to the latter. In other words, treat the difference as accidental in order that the phenomena may be observed in their purity, and our observations not interfered with by disturbing circumstances that have nothing to do with the process in question. We know moreover that this reduction is no mere scientific process. The continual oscillations in prices, their rising and falling, compensate each other, and reduce themselves to an average price, which is their hidden regulator. It forms the guiding star of the merchant or the manufacturer in every undertaking that requires time. They know that when a long period of time is taken, commodities are sold neither over nor under, but at their average price. Comment for more on this, see Wage, Labor, and Capital by Marx. Continuing, if therefore they thought about the matter at all, they would formulate the problem of the formation of capital as follows. How can we account for the origin of capital on the supposition that prices are regulated by the average price, i.e. ultimately by the value of the commodities. I say ultimately because average prices do not directly coincide with the values of commodities, as Adam Smith, Ricardo, and others believe. Back to the main text. Our friend Moneybags, who as yet is only an embryo capitalist, must buy his commodities at their value, must sell them at their value, and yet at the end of the process must withdraw more value from circulation than they threw into it at starting. Their development into a full-grown capitalist must take place both within the sphere of circulation and without it. These are the conditions of the problem. Hic Rhodus, hic salta, meaning prove your claim directly. And that's the end of chapter 5, and that's exactly what Marx is going to do in chapter 6, the buying and selling of labor power, the next chapter in Kapital Volume 1, and the conclusion of part 2, transformation of money into capital.